We want to transition now to our discussant. Thank you so much, Elizabeth Frankenberg from UNC Chapel Hill. Really appreciate it.
Hi, thanks. Well, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here, and I really enjoyed reading these papers or looking at the slides. Yeah, three very interesting papers, all using longitudinal disease, longitudinal data, and then focusing on chronic disease or death, or in one case, how health change is related to exposure to a cash infusion. I thought the Malawi paper did a nice job of sort of talking about the way that as adults who are now getting older in Southern African countries, they've lived through periods of very high infant and child mortality, the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and now this emerging burden of chronic diseases. So they have, this sort of history of these cohort exposures to these different demographic realities. So I will apologize in advance working from slides if I've misunderstood something. And as most of you know, I know more about Asia than Southern Africa. So with that said, a couple of different comments about the papers. So for the Malawi paper, a couple of things kind of stood out to me. I mean, one was, I guess it's biologically not surprising that HIV/AIDS remains sort of a stronger predictor of subsequent mortality than hypertension. But I was, what really kind of kept coming back to me as I was looking over your results is, these low rates of treatment and then conditional on being treated, these incredibly, lack of any effectiveness of being in the treated category for high blood pressure. And so, what I kept thinking about was you've got this health system that has perhaps been set up really to focus on HIV/AIDS. People are coming into the health system increasingly over time. Their high blood pressure is being detected. But I'm wondering, what your thoughts are on why control is so low, particularly as knowledge and diagnoses rise. And we do see like a reasonably large increase in that over time. I also thought it could be interesting for you to look at, sort of the subgroup who have the higher rates of hypertension and what their health outcomes are kind of later in the period in terms of you looked at, grip strength and I think depression, various kind of health outcomes at a later point in time. Does that look the same? That was for anybody with hypertension, but how does that look for people sort of at the higher levels of hypertension? So those are a couple comments on the Malawi paper. Turning to the cash transfers paper, so the sort of takeaway from that is that this, exposure to more cash variable didn't really seem to improve women's metabolic health. And I found myself asking two particular questions there. So, one was sort of thinking about the mechanisms through which more cash might affect the things that go into metabolic syndrome. Probably it's not going to be weight loss, but possibly trying to have better control over blood pressure or cholesterol, depending on what the health system is like and what efforts to treat those diseases are like. So, it struck me that it could be interesting to try to take a step back, given this null result at the moment, and think about the particular mechanisms. And that also led me to think about kind of undichotomizing the exposure measure in some way and also the outcomes and looking at particular components of metabolic syndrome. And I feel like underneath your data, you have all these continuous measures, and you might make some headway by undichotomizing some of what you're doing. And then it also occurred to me that it might be interesting to look and see or try to come up with a way to test whether program exposure kind of slows progression rather than reduces that falling into the 0-1 bucket in some way. Then lastly, I guess not all of your respondents are South African, so I guess there are women who are not getting these payments either because they're not South African or because they're not in the right. They don't pass the means testing or whatever, and so that also struck me as sort of a way to think about the control group. Lastly, on the mortality paper, a very nice exploration of all-cause and cause-specific mortality. I really enjoyed sort of looking and thinking about your graph on the cause-specific mortality fractions by age. It's really fascinating results. Looking at your linkages between predictors of what are the sort of predictors of death. The multiple ADL limitations and the poor self-rated health really stand out quite strongly in terms of being related to mortality. Not a new finding necessarily, but still a very intriguing one, particularly given the quite good biomarkers that you have. And then I appreciated the information you provided about the verbal autopsy interviews. I have not used those before. And I wondered if you had an impression about sort of how long they take, how well they work. I was fascinated by that technology because it is, unusual to have that kind of detail. And then lastly, I was going to ask what you know about mortality and or cause of death among those who move out of the Halsey area. And then I guess lastly, a comment for all the presenters, which, at risk of sort of raising a horrible subject, with USAID taking its programs away at the moment, maybe, and I hope that they will restart. But, I'm wondering if in the discussion period, I'd be curious what you guys think about how this is going to play out. So I will stop there. And this was a really fun session to be part of. And thanks for the opportunity.